Good evening. I wonder if some of you might have known Floyd Chapelier. He was a preacher originally from Ohio and eventually came back to Ohio in his later years. Anyway, he was working with the church in Annandale, Virginia, just outside D.C. for a number of years. And you have him to thank for my sermon this evening. But if I'm honest, you only have him to thank for the title of my sermon this evening. He invited me to speak at some lessons they were having at Annandale 15, 16 years ago. And he gave me a title for the sermon. He didn't tell me, he didn't give me any direction to go with it. He just gave me a title. I want you to preach on "The Seed is the Word." And so I thought about that, and I built a sermon and presented it. And afterward he told me, that is not what I had in mind. It was good, but that's not what I had in mind. So you have him to thank for the title of the sermon this evening. I don't know if I've preached here about a particular lesson that I've presented a few times about Jesus. Some of these introductory thoughts are similar to the introductory thoughts in that lesson. So you may have heard a bit of this before, but not the main part of the lesson. When Jesus came into this world, we might suppose that God would have given him a body, you know, an attractive face, someone appealing to look at, someone that crowds would, you know, be happy to sit and listen to. But that's not really what happened. Isaiah chapter 53, in a prophecy about Jesus, Isaiah tells us, "He has no stately form or majesty that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men." We might have chosen to do that differently if we were in charge of, you know, designing the DNA in the body that Jesus would grow up with. We might have chosen somebody more pleasing and palatable to look at. We also think of the circumstances around his birth. You know, this is the King of Israel being born into the world. This is the Messiah, the Christ, that had been prophesied of for centuries, for millennia before this, from almost back to the creation. And he's born in a manger because there was no place for Joseph and Mary, the expected child, to stay. And the guests, the visitors who came that night, who God notified, you know, he's born, and they come, it's not the nobility of the Jews. It's some shepherds, you know, probably weren't real clean. They've been out with their sheep at night. But that's who the visitors were. And where did Jesus grow up? Where was he from? He was from Galilee. In John chapter 7, the Pharisees are talking with Nicodemus. And in verse 72, they tell Nicodemus, "Search and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee." Earlier in that same chapter, verse 41, the crowds are debating, could this be the Messiah? You know, is this the Christ? I don't know. Some of them say, surely the Christ isn't going to come out of Galilee. And in John chapter 1, in verse 46, after Philip is sent to Nathanael, you know, we found the Messiah, come and see. And Nathanael says in return, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth, this small little village in Galilee. Galilee was the part of the land of the Jews that the other part looked down on. You know, those backward people. You know, we've got Jerusalem, the big city, the temple. And yet Jesus came from Galilee. We think about the advance man, maybe you could say, the forerunner of Jesus, the man who was sent to prepare the hearts of the people and to tell them that the Christ is at hand, the kingdom is at hand. He's here, he is near. And who was that? That was John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who just kind of stayed out in the wilderness. He wasn't in Jerusalem. He didn't wear nice robes like the other people wore, or even kind of plain robes like maybe the common people wore. He wore a camel skin. And if people heard about his diet, he ate locusts and honey. That was his food. And he did most of his baptizing not in the clean water pools of Jerusalem, but over there in the Jordan River. You remember Naaman in the Old Testament, Naaman from Syria, who came to be healed of his leprosy? And Elijah told him to go and dip 7 times in the Jordan. And at first, Naaman didn't want to do that. He's like, that Jordan? I've got rivers back home, the Abana and the far better rivers, far nicer rivers. But the Jordan is where John the Baptist, who preceded Jesus, was baptizing. As Jesus is introduced to the public, with his face that was not very attractive apparently, coming from Galilee, with a story of a birth that not only, I neglected to mention one thing, that not only happened in a manger, but had surrounding details that might make people wonder, who is the father of this boy? Because it wasn't Joseph, apparently. And then the man that came before him, not the kind of choices that might be advised by most people. Really terrible marketing, someone might say. If you want to pull people in, if you want to attract people to what you're offering, you try to make it as desirable as possible for the largest number of people that you can. You don't want to do things that people would look at and, turn away from. You think about our commercials on TV. Does anybody still watch TV? All our advertising, it's all wonderful, it's beautiful, you want to be part of this. And the arrival of Jesus just wasn't like that. We generally think you don't want to rule anyone out if you can help it, but it's almost as if God is doing exactly that. As if he's providing an excuse for some people not to believe. I'm not sure that Paul, I'm turning to 2 Thessalonians. I'm not sure that Paul had this exactly in mind when he wrote this passage. But in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 11, Paul says, "And for this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in wickedness." When Jesus chose the 12 men who would be closest to him and who would eventually be his leading advocates, he just chose 12 common men. No recognition, no fame. In our marketing-driven world, we probably would have made a lot of these choices differently. But God sees differently than we do. God was aiming for people who were humble, and were willing to be humble. Because humility is required in order to serve Jesus, in order to put all our trust in him. And if a person is not willing to be humble, then, he may come and make some appearance as a Christian, but he's never going to be someone faithful to God. He's not willing to be humble. And the humble, those are the ones God is seeking. The people who disregard all the fluff around something and are not appealed to by the fact that, it looks good, and if I associate myself with this thing that looks good, maybe I'll look good. And a lot of people think that way. God was going to let the product sell itself, so to speak. He was going to let the message of salvation sell itself, because he was looking for the humble who just want what's good. In Matthew chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, Matthew 11, verse 25. At that time Jesus answered and said, I praise you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you hid these things from the wise and intelligent and revealed them to babes. Yes, Father, for thus it was well-pleasing in your sight. Hid it from the people who think they're wise. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, similar thoughts here that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world, things that proud people look at and say, oh, that's foolish. The foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, that he might nullify the things that are. If we back up in that chapter just a little bit to verse 23, we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. You know, that's also not the kind of message that appeals to worldly people proud of themselves and wanting to be seen as somebody important. The Owens said, I've got a great message for you. I put my trust in this man because he died a miserable death. It's not a message that the prideful find attractive. Verse 21 of the same chapter. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. It would be through the message that people would believe and have salvation. Not through a lot of stuff around the message. Not by an attractive leader. Not by a leader from among the part of the population that everybody looks up to. Not by someone with a great story about how the nobility was attracted to him. No, it's just about the message preached. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness, the so-called foolishness, of the message preached to save those who believe. You know the parable of the sower in Luke chapter 8. You throw the seed and it falls on these different kinds of ground, and on some kinds of ground, the ground just doesn't take it in. And there's no growth. Seed doesn't produce anything. And other kinds of ground, the ground takes it, but then the weeds of that ground, kill it and choke it and kill it off. But on some ground that's ready for that seed, wonderful growth happens. The seed is the Word, Jesus says in Luke chapter 8, verse 11. The seed is the Word. The Word, here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the message preached. That's what causes growth. That's what creates faith in people. 20th century and 21st century denominations don't get this. They have all of their programs, all of their offerings, all of their beautiful buildings, all of their options and activities and all the things that make coming to that church building fun and enjoyable and beautiful in a secular kind of way. That's what they so often use to appeal to people. Preached a lesson recently at Hillcrest about how churches have become more secular, not spiritual, but the opposite of that, secular, worldly, materialistic. And that's what they use. They use all of these things to pull people in. That's not what causes growth. The seed is the Word of God, the message preached. That's what causes growth. And I'm convinced that it's not just denominations that don't get that. I think there's a number of brethren who don't get that, who don't understand that it is the seed, that it is the Word that is the seed that causes growth, that Romans chapter 1, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. The gospel, the Word, that's what causes growth. Do we believe that? I want to mention three things, discuss kind of three things with you this evening, wherein it seems doubtful that all Christians understand that and believe that. One has to do with having a church building. Now, I don't have a problem with having a church building. But for some, having a church building is just a necessity and an attractive building, hopefully. Because if you don't have a building, well, years ago, I worked with a small congregation. We rented a space in a public building. And I remember one of the men saying in our discussions, we've got to get a church building. We're never going to grow if we don't have a church building. Churches in the first century have church buildings? No, I didn't think so. But that's the thinking sometimes, that we've got to have a church building, and we want it to be an attractive church building. All the kind of thinking that was not the kind of thinking God had introducing Jesus to the world. Some years ago, I worked with a church. We had a church building. It was not an attractive building. It just wasn't. I mean, it was in good repair, but it just was not an attractive building. It was kind of on the edge of the part of town that, you know, maybe a little bit sketchy. But we worshiped there. And all around us were, this is the early 2000s, and all around us, these great big church buildings, the denominations were being built. I remember a sign, a billboard sign in front of the construction of one of them that said, "We're building this church for you." I think there's somebody else who might be building a church for, and that's questionable use of the word church, but anyway. And there were these great big buildings with all these activities and all these special parts of the building for all these different kinds of things that have nothing to do with worshiping God, really. And, you know, you can think, how do we compete with that? I remember at that same time, I got a phone call. My number was on the church advertising thing. I got a phone call one day, and this woman asking me, saw something about your church, and I was just wondering what you have to offer. Well, the gospel. But that wasn't what she was looking for. She was looking for all those extra things, things that will pull people in. And it does, it pulls people in. But it's not really faith in Jesus that it creates in them. Ed Harrell, I don't know if any of you ever knew Ed Harrell. Ed Harrell was my favorite preacher to listen to. Besides being a preacher, he was also a religious historian. Ed Harrell pointed out that in the first half of the 20th century, New Testament churches like this one grew faster than almost all other religious groups when they were in simple, ugly buildings on the wrong side of town. Buildings are not what cause growth. What's the seed? The seed is the word. The message preached is what saves. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. Buildings are not the seed that causes growth. Let's go to another thing that sometimes people put their trust in. And this is what we need to do in order for the church to grow. And it's the phrase that is often used is church growth techniques. I don't know if any of you have ever heard a preacher or somebody talk about church growth techniques. About a decade ago, I asked a group of preachers to sit down with me down in Florida and asked them, you know, I want to talk about ideas advice, counsel, for pulling people from the community, helping them find the gospel, helping our church to grow. And a lot of what they wanted to talk about was things like seating capacity ratios. I didn't even think about this till just now, but this is a good example of a bad seating capacity ratio. The idea is that there's kind of a percentage of the space that you have available that you want to have full. And so, for example, a group your size should probably get rid of maybe the last 6 rows of pews, because you want a good ratio. You want to have some space available for visitors. You don't want it to feel too packed. You want people to feel comfortable coming in and easy to find a seat. But you don't want it to look like, well, you've got all of this seating and there's so few people here. I don't know if I want to come to church here. That was a real important factor to some of these men. I don't deny that there's maybe something to that, but that's not what I had in mind when I was seeking counsel for helping a church to grow. One of the other things they talked about was parking and seating for visitors. You want to have adequate parking, and you want to have some seats at the rear available for visitors when they come in, because they might not feel comfortable coming all the way to the front. And there's some truth to that. They talk about having designated greeters. So, you know, there's the concern. You might have a visitor and nobody talks to that visitor. So we're going to designate certain people to be greeters. They're going to stand in the foyer and greet those people. We'll assign certain people to this task, maybe for a period of time. And that way, you know, we'll get our visitors greeted, and they'll be greeted in the way we want them to be greeted. And that's going to create a great atmosphere. Talk about having an attractive foyer so that people walk in and they have a really good first impression. And when they walk, so when they leave the foyer and they come into the auditorium, they're already feeling good about being there. We talked about having a building on a main road. You've got that here. You've got a building on a main road. At the time I was working with a congregation that, you know, there's a through street where the congregation was located, but it wasn't a main road. And you just would not call that a main road, although it was kind of a through street. And, you know, I mentioned that, you know, well, we're not located on a main road. A couple of the men just took themselves out from the discussion at that point, because they thought it was hopeless for us to grow if we were not going to locate ourselves on a main road. Now, all things being equal, if I'm in on the planning of constructing a church building, and we've got 2 lots available to us, and one's on a dead-end road at the edge of town, and another one is on the main thoroughfare that everybody will see, and they're the same price, well, in that case, I'd probably go for the one on the main road. But a main road is not really what makes the difference in teaching people the gospel and reaching people. One visiting preacher where my dad was preaching, there was a visiting preacher there, and he was preaching on these church growth techniques with all of these principles. There was a young man in the congregation there who had just recently been converted to Christ, recently become a Christian. His name was Jack. And the visiting preacher found out that Jack had recently become a Christian, recently started attending there, learned the gospel, was baptized in Christ. And so after the service one evening, he asked Jack, so what attracted you to this church? And Jack just said, I heard the truth. That's the seed. That's what creates faith. I want to say a few more words about this idea of having designated greeters, not because I think it's the most important of all of these things to think about, but because the mistake that people sometimes make with this is a common mistake to a bunch of issues. And that mistake is that when you know in your heart that what would be best is if everybody in the congregation learns to think about not just themselves and what they want to talk about after services and who they want to talk to after services, but they think about that visitor. And they say, I can talk to that person. I can make that person feel welcome. I could ask that person if they'd like to learn more. I could encourage that person to come back. They know in their hearts that would be best, but they feel like we'll never get that. So we'll come up with something different. And it's this idea of having designated greeters. I was visiting a congregation in Texas. My niece and her husband, my niece and my nephew-in-law, I don't know if nephew-in-law is a word, but I use it. He was preaching there as a very young man. There was another preacher there who I also knew, was a good friend of mine, in fact. But I knew no one else in this congregation. It was a congregation, if I remember well, about 300. It was a large congregation in Texas. You know, everything's bigger in Texas, right? And when I got to my niece and nephew-in-law's place to stay for the weekend, David told me, hey, we just started this thing. We've designated certain people to be greeters. You know, this set of people has it for this month. There'll be a different set of people that has it for the next month, and so on through the year. And so what do you think about going in separately from us? Driving separately, don't walk in with us, and just kind of get a feel for how our greeters do, what effect that has, and kind of let me know your thoughts afterwards. All right, yeah, cool, I'll do that. So I walked in, and this is a big foyer area, and right in the center of it, before kind of the center doors to go into the auditorium, was a circle of 6, 7 people, men and women, just kind of standing there talking and chatting. And as I kind of approached those doors, they saw me, and they stopped talking and introduced themselves to me, and I introduced myself to them, and I don't remember exactly, but they probably asked if, you know, it's my first time there, and yes it is, and so they told me, well, we're about to have Bible classes here in about 5 or 10 minutes, just through these doors to the auditorium, and after that we'll have our worship assembly, and hope you enjoy it. Okay, that was fine, that was good. And I went in and sat down. And after services, I was still thinking about, okay, I want to get a good feel for everything about how a visitor feels in this congregation. And so after service, it was a large group of people. I've already described that. 3 sections of long pews, significantly longer than these pews even, 3 sections, and kind of deep. I was seated way over there. And after the closing prayer, I stood up and kind of stood there for a second and looked around, and you know, there's people here, there's people there, there's people over here, all talking amongst themselves. And just kind of stood there for a minute. Nobody approached me. I kind of went down through one of the sections of pews to the next aisle. I was on the far end. And kind of was just moving slowly, giving anybody a chance to talk to me who might want to talk to me. And nobody approached me. And I finally made my way out the doors, the center doors at the back of the auditorium. There were a lot of people in the foyer, standing around, talking, being friendly with each other, and just kind of, you know, made my way eventually a little farther back to the water fountain and got a drink. And yeah, I don't know if any of you have seen the John Travolta meme, like, what? And I finally, you know, came back through the foyer and back into the main auditorium, and most of the people were gone from the auditorium at this point. There was a woman and, I don't know, 2 or 3 kids, and she spoke to me. Asked me how I was doing, asked me if I was visiting. Yeah, I am. I'm from such and such a place, and I think eventually I told her, yeah, I'm actually Amy Ray's uncle. One person, except for that circle of people at the beginning. Why did that happen? Well, that's the official greeter's job. It's not my job. That's their job. So we've got designated greeters. What about all the designated greeters? I don't remember what month that was. Let's say it was August. What about all the designated greeters who served in September, October, or June, July? All of those people. Well, it's not my month. I do that in January. See. I know the reasoning for having designated greeters. And I'm not saying it's always a mistake to ask somebody, hey, could you, kind of be aware of visitors and be sure that you greet them. I'm not saying that's wrong. But this whole idea of church growth techniques grows out of looking at things, not really counting on the message of the gospel for the visitor and for ourselves. So the message of the gospel for ourselves is that we each get it in our hearts. We each get the gospel in our hearts so that we're more concerned with that visitor we see that has never been here before, might not be a Christian at all, might be seeking something. He came out that Sunday. And that I have it in my heart to be interested in that person. And I'm more interested in that person than I am the conversation here with my best friend that I talk with every time I'm at services, because I see this visitor. If we would teach people to get the gospel, the seed, thoroughly in their hearts to where they care about that, well, that's I think what God would prefer. That we each become the people we ought to be, that we each have that seed firmly planted in ourselves and growing and prospering to where we do that kind of thing. But we've given up on the word and say, well, that'll never happen. You can't get people to do that. Can't count on people growing to the point that they'll do that. So we'll have designated greeters. We've given up on the word. We've given up on the thing that is actually the seed that causes growth. It's the word that changes hearts and causes growth. Helps us to be soul seekers, helps us to look beyond ourselves. The seed is the word, not our church growth techniques. One final thing I want to talk about that sometimes we think is the way to get to people, while we neglect part of the word that is the actual seed. And that is to have only positive preaching and teaching. We want every sermon to be encouraging and uplifting and just makes you feel good. We want lots of stories. Now I'm told more stories than usual in this sermon tonight. Stories can serve a purpose if they actually serve a purpose in a lesson. But we want sermons with lots of stories and an occasional punchline because we think that that's what causes a church to grow. Everything's encouraging and uplifting, everything's positive. There should be some positive, uplifting preaching. Definitely. Absolutely. Some preachers, it seems, believe that all preaching should be negative. And that's not good. There should be a balance. But not everything is going to be positive and uplifting. But sometimes we want it that way. Sometimes preachers want it that way. Sometimes folks in the pew who aren't preachers want it to be that way. And we don't want ever anything to be said that could upset people. Think about Jesus in John chapter 4. There Jesus was talking with this woman at the well. And his message to her is not all positive, upbeat, you're doing great. John chapter 4, verse 16. He said to her, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Not sure what her thought there was with that. But Jesus replies, there in the middle of verse 17, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly. That would not fly in a lot of churches today. How could you just bring that up? How could you talk to a person about the problem in their life? What, you mean talk about sin? The thing that keeps us away from God? Jesus did not believe, and you will read all through the Gospels, Jesus did not believe that every message should be positive and uplifting. He wasn't harsh with her, and we shouldn't be harsh with people. But he spoke the word, because the word is what she needed. The message, the gospel, is what she needed. And it yielded growth in her. And in the people of the city broadly on that day. Give you one more example about this kind of thinking. When I was living in the Czech Republic, there was another man, a local man, who was also engaged in the teaching responsibilities and preaching responsibilities. And he had taught a young man and converted him, and he came to Christ and he was baptized, and we were all excited about that. And one day in my conversation with this young man who had been baptized, I realized, I don't remember now if he was married and having an affair, or if he was unmarried but engaged, not engaged, but involved in an illicit sexual relationship. But there was some kind of sexual sin going on regularly in his life. And so I said to my fellow worker there, I said, because he worked with him mostly, I said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but this is going on in this person's life. He said, yeah, I know. Have you said anything to him about it? Have you talked with him about it? No, I haven't. I said, well, I think we need to talk with him about that. No, I don't think we should talk with him about it. We just need to let him continue to be here as a fellow Christian, as a brother in Christ, and let some time go by, let him begin to like us, and then we can talk with him about it, after he wants to be with us. We are not the source of salvation. The gospel is. The Lord is. And that man needed more of the Lord in himself. In the Roman Empire, which had sin at least equal and probably much worse than the sin in our societies today, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, when there was sexual sin going on, Paul talked to them about it immediately. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Finally then, brethren, Paul writes this letter, if you remember, soon after this church was established. Finally then, brethren, we request and exhort you in the Lord Jesus, that you, as you receive from us instruction as to how you ought to walk and please God, just as you do actually walk, that you excel still more. Because they were doing a lot of good, but still needed to grow. For you know what commandments we gave you. He'd already talked about this subject. By the authority of the Lord Jesus, for this is the will of God, your sanctification, that is, that you abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in lustful passion like the Gentiles who do not know God. Paul did not think, well, give those people some time to appreciate me as an apostle, and it's more time for them to kind of gel together and like being part of that church, and then we can spring it on you. That is a sinful arrangement there. The thing that causes growth is the word, the message preached. We need to help people know God. We need to help people like God. Not that they like us, but they like God. They love the Lord. We need to help people see His Word. Whether you have a church building or not, whether you have these things that are often referred to as these church growth techniques or not, and some of them I would rather not, whether we make ourselves especially likable, attractive to people, these things are not what cause growth. The seed is the Word. The gospel is God's power for salvation. And with that, I'll end my lesson for this evening. If you are thinking about your own life today and realizing that there may be some things you need to make right with brethren here, or just a request for prayers, or to be baptized into Christ, we'd ask you to come as we stand and sing.
There's a fountain free
Just for you and me.